Thanks, Gustav. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I really want to thank you for inviting me and for coming to this lecture. It is for me a delightful chance to visit this city and this wonderful new National Library. It was particularly welcome news to me that such a project for a new library and related events could have developed, especially as these are actually hard times for libraries in the country that I'm from, that is Italy. So please accept my warmest congratulations and my best wishes for the future development of this library. Before I start, I also want to say that I'm not Catholic. I come from a Catholic country, of course, and culture, but I'm not religious, so I do not have any apologetic intention in my research. Since we are in a library, what I would like to do today is to show how books can be used to make history. This is very obvious, but it is true in many ways. Books are, of course, media. They are supports for text to be transmitted through space and time. They are, in the first place, material objects. And I would like to show how books as material objects can play a relevant role in understanding the past, not only because of the text they carry, but also for what they can tell us about their past, their owners, and their readers. The image of the medieval church at its highest levels as the stronghold of knowledge at the time is quite conventional and widely accepted by scholarship, regardless the positive or rather negative connotation that this vision can assume within different ideological contexts. Working on the history of the book or history of libraries in the Middle Age means, to a large extent, working on the history of religious libraries. The panorama of studies changes dramatically with the beginning of the modern age. From a certain point onwards, religious libraries seem to lose most of their glamour to become, at once, to the eyes of scholars, fortresses of obscurantism, opposite to modern libraries, the ones of humanists. The picture of the rude and illiterate monk has descended from the first glimmers of the Renaissance through the Counter-Reformation, the Enlightenment and the struggle against modernism to the present-day lay scholarship, and is still influencing the shared perception of the medieval and early modern age. And you can see here a picture from a manuscript of Boccaccio with a monk that is not exactly behaving as he should. Much of this picture of the Roman Church as a fortress of obscurantism is a result of the struggle for liberty against censorship, and obviously involved and determined the view on institutions such as the Inquisition and the Congregation of the Index. Being censorship a topic that affects everyday life, the Inquisition has catalyzed a great deal of attention during the ages. Unfortunately, the opinion expressed have frequently been adulterated by mystification, intentional or unintentional to various extent, for ignorance or propaganda. An example is what you can see here, some scenes of torture named Horrors of the Inquisition, Tortures of the Inquisition, and More Tortures of the Inquisition, found in the Encyclopedia of Witchcraft and Demonology by Russell Hope Robbins, a book published in 1959, half century ago, that means relatively recently. The author claims the source of the images to be the Martyrology by Samuel Clarke, published in 1651, and this is indeed correct. What is not correct is the caption for the images that are actually related in Clarke's publication to the persecution of the early Christian martyrs in Persia, as you can see the same picture that we have already seen in its original context. The persecution of what he calls the church of God in Bohemia, and the persecution of the Christ of Church in the Valteline. Another example would be this image from the 18th century of a stake burning for people condemned by the Inquisition, and even more impressive from an earlier period, people who become a crowd in the apologetic treatise by John Fox, published already in 1576. Even besides intentionally misleading works, mistakes and misunderstandings on the Inquisition as an historical institution are still quite common to be found. In the last 2 decades, studies about censorship moved their focus from persecuted groups or individuals to the structure and procedures of censoring institutions, in the first place, the Roman Inquisition. For a long time, the main source on the Inquisition and what is relevant today on the circulation and possession of forbidden books has been archival sources, notably trials. No need to remind how scholars struggled to access the records of the archive of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, commonly known as the Holy Office, which at last opened its doors to scholars in January 1998. Still, as Peter Goodman warned, and I quote, "Despite their popular image, which does not need to be documented, enough is not yet known about the Roman Congregation of the Inquisition and the Index. Documentation and analysis are required. This is no simple task, despite the opening of the archives in Rome." End of quotation. Indeed, despite the number of recent accurate and painstaking studies on the institutions in charge of censorship, the overview can even be misleading if separately considered from the effects that rules and decisions had in fact. Censorship as a phenomenon proves to be even harder to investigate because of its object, dealing with privation rather than with actual facts or events. What I will try to do is to show how books can be used as evidence for a new history of censorship in the early modern age. The crucial role played by the printing press in the spread of ideas has been widely acknowledged since already the 15th century. This awareness, strengthening during the Reformation and shared by contemporaries, both Protestant or Catholic, would extensively affect the policy of early modern Europe towards the book from the 16th century onwards. Nonetheless, the plan to control book production was not born in the 16th century, nor was it directly caused by the Reformation. Neither was the idea of banning text new. The Christian Church struggled in its early centuries against doctrines defined as deviant or heretical, and through this struggle defined its own doctrine and identity. What was really new was the number of texts made available to the market by printing. The flourishing of production between the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th centuries generated the need for ordered lists of books for different purposes. Bibliographies drawn up for the purpose of censorship, reinforced and turned into regulation by both ecclesiastical and civil authorities, became, in fact, what we know as indexes of forbidden books. Early modern censorship started its rise with the requirement of approval for books to be printed. This precaution was meant to prevent publication of new works at a stage when the anxiety about the spread of malicious texts already available on the market had not yet developed. Pre-publication censorship first occurred in isolated instances in the last quarter of the 15th century in Italy and Germany. Pre-publication approval by a competent ecclesiastical authority, commonly known as imprimatur, in Latin, let it be printed, became mandatory in 1487. For Rome and its surroundings, this had to be granted by the cardinal vicar and the master of the Sacred Apostolic Palace, the Pope's personal theologian. Despite his role, formally limited to the area of Rome, the master of the Sacred Palace became one of the most influential figures involved in the 16th and 17th century struggle for censorship. Outside of Rome, control over printing was delegated to bishops and local inquisitors. In the Venetian Republic, home of the most flourishing printing industry in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries, the papal legate Niccolò Franco established in 1491 a diocesan approval for works dealing with doctrine and ecclesiastical matters. The anxiety about books published and already in circulation was, on the contrary, a genuine effect of the Reformation. The embryo of a list of banned books was in the bull Exsurge Domine, through which Leo X proscribed the whole corpus of Luther's work. The judgment not only affected Luther, anyone reading or owning any edition of his works was subject to excommunication. Formal indexes of forbidden books originated in the mid-century in Catholic lands, but far from Rome. Between 1544 and 1556, theologians at the Sorbonne banned 528 works overall through 6 consecutive indexes. Theologians of the University of Louvain, at the request of Charles V and Philip II, also collected their condemnations in 3 indexes drawn up between 1546 and 1558. The 3 indexes of the Spanish Inquisition, issued in the 1550s, had great relevance as well. Rather than being the work of academic theologians, the Spanish Index was the official statement of an ecclesiastical institution in the country that was, at the time, the stronghold of Catholicism. Not only was the Spanish Inquisition formally independent from Rome, it was powerful enough to influence even the Roman Church. The fact that a large part of the Italian peninsula was under Spanish domination also contributed to the influence of this index on Italy and thus on papal policy. In the same decades, decrees and indexes of forbidden books started to be issued in Italian states as well. Following the example of Milan, Lucca, and Siena, Venice published its first index in 1549. This catalogo, that you can see here, printed by Vincenzo Valgrisi, listed the opera omnia of 47 authors, plus about 100 individual, mostly anonymous works. The home of Catholicism, Rome, came later. One of the most persuasive arguments against the Venetian indexes was that no index existed yet in Rome, where books could still be sold and bought without any trouble. The work on the draft for the first Roman index took 10 years to complete. Promulgated in 1559, it banned the entire production of about 550 authors and the number of individual titles. It included, besides heretical works and authors, vernacular literature and anything looking anti-clerical, immoral, lascivious, or obscene. This index was the ultimate expression of the uncompromising attitude of Pope Paul IV. In contemporary perception, Paul IV wanted to expunge from human memory the names of heretics. Persuaded that books were the vehicle for propagation of heretical doctrines, the former Inquisitor General Gian Pietro Carafa, shortly after his election to the papacy in 1555, named a commission to work on a universal Catholic list of forbidden books to replace any index released elsewhere. In his mind, this plan was not only meant to destroy heresy, it was the vehicle to reinforce papal supremacy throughout the whole of Catholic Christendom. Shortly after the death of Paul IV, a new commission was appointed to revise the index. Its severity had upset not only bookmen, but also scholars and intellectuals all around Europe. The discontent was so extreme and shared amongst so many different social levels that Rome celebrated the death of the Pope by setting fire to the Holy Office buildings and freeing the prisoners. Humanists, legists, and medical scholars were worried about how seriously this policy would affect their professional collections. Even Jesuits were amongst the strongest opponents of such strict and indiscriminate prescriptions. A new index was published in 1564. It was, however, immediately perceived as transitional. Opposing opinions on whether a number of works and authors should be banned or not, expressed in lively debate during the Council of Trent, could not be reconciled and were mirrored in internal contradictions. In March 1571, a new commission of cardinals was named by the new Pope, Pius V, to revise the index again. It was the birth of the Congregation of the Index of Prohibited Books. Not to be confused with the Holy Office or Inquisition, the Congregation of the Index had the Master of the Sacred Palace as its permanent secretary and was in charge of revision of the index and of expurgation of books. Even if not specifically devoted to the control of printing and circulation of books, the Roman Inquisition also played a relevant role, particularly in the enforcement of the prescription of the indexes. From 1570 onwards, the Holy Office started collecting its resolutions about books in a specific series of volumes about Censura Librorum. In the following years, both the Congregation and the Inquisition undertook the painstaking job of supplementing the index by sending lists of brand new forbidden works and authors to Italian dioceses. Updating the index became a crucial point in avoiding the increasing sense of confusion that reigned over censorship in the last quarter of the 16th century. The work on the revision of the index started in 1587, and after two indexes never formally promulgated, the new index was enforced by Clement VIII in May 1596. It should be stressed that none of the indexes was ever formally discharged, not even after a new one had been issued. It became usual procedure to take into consideration all of the indexes, including foreign ones. That was not a straightforward process. Internal contradictions within indexes and between each other would have disoriented the most earnest censors and inquisitors. Some of the prohibitions of the index of 1559 were not included in that of 1564. To mention a notorious and significant instance, in the index of 1559, Erasmus was listed amongst the authors of the first class, heretics to be forbidden completely. But in the index of 1564, he appeared amongst both those of the first and second class, authors whose works could be read if expurgated. A similar fate befell to a number of Savonarola's works, banned by the Pauline Index but allowed once expurgated by the Tridentine one. The indexes were not only lists of forbidden books, but a complex set of rules with which to comply and officials to take care of them. The confusion generated by contradictions amongst the indexes was made even worse by the rules de prohibitione librorum, drawn up by the Tridentine Commission to mitigate the harsh condemnation of the first Roman index. The rules de prohibitione librorum became, in fact, guidelines to complete the indexes, where prohibitions seemed not to be strict enough. The 10 rules of the Tridentine Index turned into an instructio articulated in 18 paragraphs attached to the Clementine Index. The first attempts at censorship were not very effective, at least until the 1540s, but 4 decades of indexes of forbidden books would eventually have an effect. Nevertheless, the quite popular portrait of the Catholic Church as a stronghold of uncompromising intolerance is rather an historical product itself than a reliable picture of the actual facts. The enforcement of the censorship machine was not a straightforward process, and the work of the congregation did not conclude with the publication of the index in 1596. It was, in fact, the start rather than the end of the process. Even if opposition caused by different beliefs was minimal in Italy, many of the prohibitions listed in the indexes met with the opposition of intellectuals and bookmen trying to protect their professions and business. Despite the steady growth of censorship during the century, persuading both the bookmen and the most eager readers to act with caution, circulation of banned texts would never completely stop. This would suggest the success of the tricks of the clandestine market and the subsequently secret retaining of forbidden books. But a moderate trend also pushed inside the Roman Church toward a legitimate compromise. In a few cases, this would take the shape of licenses to be granted from local inquisitors to keep and read forbidden books, but there was still an inclination towards a solution that would not apply to only a few individuals. Institutions in charge of censorship soon became well aware of the many everyday issues of the enforcement of the index, and thus keen to find a reasonable and feasible way to an unconditional and indiscriminate interdiction. The process that changed the Italian culture and conscience occurred through books burnings, but also through compromise. What I'm trying to do in my research is to see how and how much the indexes of forbidden books influenced 16th century culture, from evidence on books, that means on book collections, of the actual consequences of this policy. To do this, I'm focusing on the former library of an Italian cloister, the survived cloister of San Pier Piccolo in the Tuscan town of Arezzo. Through 3 inventories dating from the 16th, 18th, and 19th centuries and signs on books, I was able to rediscover in the Municipal Library of Arezzo more than 350 early printed books of the former collection of San Pier Piccolo. What you see here is a picture of the first page of the 16th century inventory I'm working on. This inventory describes more than 1,050 and 500 printed books, a medium to good size for a monastic library in the 16th century. And this is the 18th century inventory of the same library. I'm not going to talk about how I was able to find these books, which was itself a challenge indeed, but I'm going to show you a few of them to see if they can tell us something about the approach to forbidden books in post-Tridentine Italy. This first book is a copy of a 1531 edition of the Vitae by Plutarch, printed in Basel by Johann Bebel. The first Roman index, promulgated in 1559, included Bebel amongst the printers whose production was forbidden completely. In the 16th century inventory, this book is described as Plutarchus, De Vita Graecorum et Romanorum, Basileia, 1531, avoiding any mention of the suspicious printer. This did not happen by chance. The 16th century inventory had been drawn up to comply with a specific request from the Roman congregation of the Index. In the context of the enforcement of the Index, promulgated in 1596, the congregation asked all of the main religious authorities to send to Rome reports about suspect books owned by all those under their jurisdiction. This was in order to facilitate the distinction between books to be burned and books to be handed in to bishops and inquisitors, who, once they made sure they had been correctly expurgated, would eventually grant a license to keep them. At least until the mid-1560s, early 70s even, Protestant literature was still available to Italian readers through a flourishing and rather well-organized clandestine market. This request was intended to provide the congregation with an accurate picture of how many and which forbidden books were still in circulation at the end of the 16th century. Initially, the congregation of the Index had only requested lists of banned texts. The response of religious houses was slow and scarce. A legitimate fear of losing part of their collections could have well caused delays and omissions in the submissions of the lists. But it was more likely the effort of such a time-consuming job that discouraged the religious officials from drawing up the inventories. However, the few short book lists sent to Rome were only useful inasmuch as they demonstrated the lack of clarity over what was forbidden. The size and complexity of successive and sometimes contradictory indexes, as we have seen earlier, made the task of compiling a list of forbidden books a difficult one. Books could appear as suspicious for reasons that are sometimes hard to understand. In one case, for instance, a book was listed simply because it was printed in the 15th century. Doubts and uncertainties were sometimes made explicit in the margins with annotations such as dubium. Once in Rome, those book lists are likely to have generated reasonable doubts about the reliability of those who had compiled the lists to identify forbidden books. Despite many complaints and delays on the side of regular orders, the result of this policy was a series of inventories of the books owned by religious orders in post-Tridentine Italy, compiled between 1596 and 1603. This quite long introduction is functional to the point that I'm trying to make here. Bebel's name had been carefully deleted by both title page and colophon of this book from the collection of San Pier Piccolo, and consistently was prudently kept under silence in the record which relates to the same book. This omission did not happen by chance or mistake. Please note that despite the ink, the name of Bebel is still readable. Even if we want to assume that the deletions could have been made before the inventory was drawn up, it is quite unlikely that who compiled it could not read the name. Quite the opposite, indeed. A second example to prove that not only the books, but the inventory had been expurgated, as well with an eye to the rules of the Roman Index, is offered by this copy of an edition of the work of the Italian scholar Lilio Gregorio Giraldi, the Deis Gentium, Varia et Multiplex Historia, printed again in Basel by the press of Jacob Kündig for Johann Oporinus. The name to be deleted from the title page and colophon was, this time, that of Oporinus, condemned as printer of forbidden books by the Roman indexes of 1559 and 1564. This book is described in the 16th century inventory as the Deis Gentium di Gregorio Geraldo Ferrariensis, Basileae ex officina Jacobi Parci, 1560. Keep it silent, the name of Oporinus. The same happened to another book printed again by Oporinus, the Contra Mahometicam Fidem Christiana et Orthodoxa Assertio by the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzenus, described in the Vatican lists as Ioannis Cantacuzeni Constantinopolitani Contra Mahometicam Fidem, Basileia, 1536. I'm sorry for the overlap. As you can see here, the only name to be censored on the title page is that of Rudolf Walter, who translated the work and would become, in 1575, the third antistes of the Reformed Church of Zurich. I have to say that translators are not usually mentioned in inventories, even if they had to, making the omission not particularly relevant in itself in this case. And the same could be said for the printer in this case, as he does not even appear on the title page. But notably, the record does include the year of printing that is not on the title page. Indeed, who drawn up the inventory looked for a date of printing at the end of the book and found one on the colophon of the third volume bound together. He wrote down the date, but deliberately ignored or even deleted himself the name of the printer. A copy of the Latin dictionary, the monumental work in 3 in-folio volumes, edited and printed by Robert Estienne in Paris in 1543, has been preserved in the Library of Arezzo, despite the wide condemnation shared by different countries of Robert Estienne, both as an author and as a printer. His name, indeed, had been covered by paper strips on both title page and colophon. As you can see in this picture, consistently, the Vatican inventory reads Thesaurus Linguae Latinae, Tomi 3, Parisis, 1543. The final case that I'm going to show you is a copy of the edition of the Decretales by Gregorius IX, printed in Lyon by Pierre Fradin for Hugues de la Porte and Antoine Vincent in 1559. The copy used by the friars of San Pier Piccolo has been heavily censored and offers, indeed, a wide sample of different ways of censoring a book. Some parts of the text, apparently suspicious, have been stricken out or deleted altogether, covered in ink or glued paper, but there are also highlights and marginalia, amongst which I particularly like the one that you have seen on the first slide, Caute Lege. To be forbidden here, it was not the author, Pope Gregory IX, of course, nor were his Decretales and milestones of medieval canon law, but neither the printer or bookseller seemed to appear in any of the indexes of forbidden books. In this case, the issue was with Charles Dumoulin, a French jurist reviled by Catholics and Calvinists alike, who edited the text used for this edition. His postils, dangerous and outrageous to the Roman Church, had been heavily censored, as you can see in these pictures. For instance, here they are covered in ink. You can see here a paper strip covering the text, and again, the Caute Lege, read with caution warning, which repeatedly appears on the margins and between the lines of the text itself. What was this practice of deleting some parts of books? The idea of expurgating books seems to appear explicitly around the mid-century. In 1554, Venetian printers and booksellers reacted to a first list of forbidden books, suggesting expurgation as a reasonable compromise to save the investment of stakeholders. The Holy Office replied that books containing theology and doctrinal works against the Roman dogma should be considered omnino damnati, but they allowed books only carrying prefatory material, glosses or comments by Protestants to be sold after the deletion of objectionable parts. This suggestion found its way to the Roman hierarchy very shortly after the promulgation of the Pauline Index. An instructio attached to the index itself explained that book owners had the chance to keep their books under the proviso of the deletion of any trace of dangerous authors, not only their glosses and comments, but notably their names. Local inquisitors, after checking the corrections, would eventually release a license to keep those expurgating books. The principle that books not dealing with Christian doctrine and not containing anything dangerous for the faith could be saved from the fire just by deleting authors' names became a milestone in the struggle for preserving books from destruction. The applicability of expurgation in place of outright condemnation to a number of cases was one of the most relevant improvements introduced by the Clementine Index in 1596. It would not only approve that books could be kept deletis delendis, it also allowed the practice of autocorrection. The procedure of self-expurgation gave a reasonable answer to such a fundamental question: who was in charge of correcting books, as inquisitors would never be capable of the whole job by themselves. Even if this resolution was dictated by practical issues rather than by unconditional trust, it marked a victory of the moderate wing of cardinals and, alongside them, of bookmen, scholars and readers very much in favor of the less restrictive rules for censorship. The plan to publish a detailed guide to the expurgation of texts as a companion to the index soon proved to be unrealistic. An Index Expurgatorius was in fact published in 1607, more than 10 years later the promulgation of the Clementine Index, but it only comprised of instructions for the correction of 50 titles, and no more were ever published. The crucial matter was not only which books had to be corrected and how, but mostly who had the appropriate competence and authority to do so. A painstaking revision of each text would have been an overwhelming task for both the congregation of the Index and the Holy Office. So would have been the correction of each book for local inquisitors. The Clementine Index was thus completed by an appendix containing detailed guidelines on book correction. It stated the possibility of getting a license to keep suspicious books, especially libri di umanità, humanist books, only deleting any postils and names of heretical authors. This censoring activity was left to the competence of individual owners. To avoid as much as possible any chance of mistake in the ones considered clever enough and apt to the task, the guidelines were quite strict and extensive. Anything sounding heretical, erroneous, scandalous, schismatic, seditious, blasphemous, or even ambiguous or offensive to pious ears should be deleted. The ban of obscene works, already in the Pauline Index, was reiterated, including a warning against classical literature. The same happened to all titles of magic and occult. The cardinals were probably persuaded that, despite the reluctance of bookmen and scholars, 4 decades of indexes had finally succeeded in making a clean sweep of the most pernicious texts, so that they could now focus on other targets. Still, in fact, they agreed to a certain extent to a practice that looks cosmetic rather than substantial censorship. Books could still be kept and read just by deleting small portions of text or sometimes names only. Moreover, books owners were responsible for this operation on their own books. I define this practice as positive censorship because a minor intervention on the text, not usually preventing the legibility of the work, could save books from destruction. The Congregation of the Index and the Holy Office had been forced to adopt resolutions that left a large margin of discretion to individual knowledge and choices. Copy inspection reveals that only in a few cases the deleted parts were not actually legible anymore. To conclude, the picture of the 16th century post-Tridentine Italian culture as blindly conservative and oppressed by an overwhelming influence of the Inquisition served well different parties, that of the Protestant propaganda, even the Roman Church itself to a certain extent, to claim a long-term and steady tradition as a warranty of authority against the Reformation. At the same time, the struggle against dangerous books was part of a wider project for the renewal of the Church alongside elimination of abuses and to pastoral reform. Unfortunately, this image has often been shallowly taken for granted even by a large part of the scholarly community. The many book burnings that took place in Italy through the 16th century undoubtedly destroyed many thousands of books, and we can easily assume that a number of editions and even works have disappeared altogether. Nonetheless, the complete destruction of all the suspicious books was beyond any expectation. There is evidence that, despite the indexes and the book burnings, scholars always maintained an access to many prohibited books, and, as we have just seen, this was true even within religious houses. There was a hiatus between the number of strict prescriptions promulgated by several institutions in charge of control and the actual tolerance towards the ownership and use of some forbidden books, or at least some parts of them. There was not any open choice for tolerance, a word that was still long to come in the 16th century, but there was an actual, inescapable tolerance as the only option. I would like to conclude by showing two images. The first one is the painting that the well-known artist Titian made for his own grave. What you might not be aware of is that Titian actually depicted himself in this dramatic scene, as you can see by comparing with this painting from the Prado. The figure on the left is his self-portrait, and the figure on the right here. Notably, about 20 years before, the same character had been already chosen by the great Michelangelo, and it is believed, again, to represent himself. Who is this character chosen by such artists to represent themselves, in the case of Titian, even to be placed on his own grave? According to iconography, this figure was Nicodemus. Nicodemus, in the Gospel of John, was one of the leading Jews of Jerusalem who was converted by Jesus, but afraid of being seen with him, only visited him secretly at night. In a letter to Martin Luther, written in 1545, John Calvin referred to dissemblers in France during the Wars of Religion, accusing them of Nicodemism to avoid persecution. In Calvin's intention, the word Nicodemism stood for religious simulation for 16th century people who secretly embraced the Reformation but were too scared to admit it openly. It seems particularly significant that two Italian artists worldwide known at their time decided to depict themselves as Nicodemus. Their shared choice looks like an admission, explicit only to a certain extent, to declare their real attitude towards the Church of Rome. I find that these images resume well the whole situation of 16th century Italy, where most of the time a formal, shallow acquiescence was enough. This was true for well-known cases at different social levels, such as Menocchio, the Italian miller described in a famous Carlo Ginzburg book, as for big names as Titian and even Galileo. And this was also true for books, for which in most cases we could only call a Nicodemetic expurgation could be enough. Things became quite different within a few years. The last quarter of the 16th century marked a step into a new era in the history of censorship. Copy expurgation declined in the face of the far more radical practice of expurgating editions. Works were purged before they even went to the presses. Some level of distortion of the works themselves became hard to avoid. Censorship deeply penetrated even the individual consciences of Catholic authors, affecting their works. An excellent example is offered again by Erasmus and his Adagia. The first Roman index included Erasmus in the first class of authors, as I have said before, banning the entire corpus of his works. It caused much discontent in the cultural world, mostly for practical reasons. The collection of Adagia, short moral stories and proverbs in Greek and Latin, accompanied by Erasmus' comments, served as school text all around Europe for the learning of Latin, especially in Jesuit schools. It was considered so irreplaceable that the Council of Trent committed Paulus Manutius to edit the text and produce an expurgated version. Erasmus' comments, core of the work, had been purged of anything that could sound inappropriate. This revised work, ab omnibus mendis vindicata, quae et veritatis catholicae studiosum lectorem poterant offendere by Paulus Manutius, was published 4 times in Venice and Florence between 1575 and 1591. All of these editions are well represented by a conspicuous number of copies in Italian libraries. None of them, though, carries any mention of the original author, Erasmus. A copy of the 1575 edition, now in the Bibliotēkā Nazionale of Rome, attributed authorship to Paulus Manutius. Not much was left, indeed, of Erasmus' original work. Still, as Grandler noticed, even in a church where the efforts for a Catholic Reformation result in a strict censorship that caused the burning of many thousands of books, a more tolerant, humanistic attitude never disappeared. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavia, for your paper. I hope we'll have a few questions. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Okay, I will use my position. And you have shown quite well that the stereotype that the Inquisition controlled everything and destroyed everything is in fact a stereotype. And in reality, people were reading forbidden texts. And yeah, I like the slide where the forbidden text was struck through, but still you could read if you wanted. My question is very simple. How many books were destroyed during the late 16th century because of the indexes in Italy, for example? Were the approximate percentage of all books printed or owned by libraries?
Well, it's hard to give a precise estimation. I would say anyway that most of the destruction happened not at the end of the century, but more around the 50s, when there were still books in circulation and also some Protestant works. I would say that most of the editions of Protestant authors, we don't have many books by Luther now in Italy. So I think these were destroyed overall. Also, works by Italian reformers are not available in Italy at the moment. But at the end of the century, the situation changed. And so also, I think they were more careful when they even printed books. So market strategy changed the thing so that it was not necessary to burn books anymore. So also, I think the example of the law book is particularly interesting because actually commentaries of lawyers that were forbidden, French lawyers, are quite a few, but it was quite common just not to declare who was. Indeed, it took some time to me to figure out why this book was censored, because the name of the editor does not appear anywhere. So I think for this reason, after the destruction, a massive destruction of, for instance, also Hebrew books at the middle of the century, after a while, it didn't happen anymore. This is my feeling about that.
Well, I will ask at least one more question. You said that the owners of the books were responsible for making corrections or doing censorship for themselves. Do you know who were the people in your institution in San Piero who were making those corrections in the text?
I think this is a very good question, very hard to answer, because we usually don't have the names of censor, because they were just like doing this job, but not signing it. So I know, for instance, the name of a censor in Lucca that was working with the bishop of Lucca, because I worked on, it was quite a particular case. But I'm still working on the books of Arezzo to try to understand something about Hans on the books. But I think that in some cases there were some more relevant personalities in the cloister. So sometimes they could be in charge of the expurgation of all the books in the cloister, but sometimes they were just responsible of their own books. And this is interesting because indeed, perhaps the idea was that someone should look after this work and just check the corrections. But in fact, it was impossible to do that. So actually, books were just left to their owners to try to comply with the rules. But if they didn't, nothing really happened. I think also the case of Menocchio is relevant because it was him he wanted to push his position in front of the church, because otherwise they just wanted to keep him quiet. They didn't really care about what he was reading, I think. So,
well, no questions. Thank you. Thank you for your paper.
Thanks. Thank you.